Hi, thanks for joining us in this webinar where I am going to take you through a real-life ransomware campaign. Now, hopefully this webinar has something for everybody in cybersecurity. I'm going to touch upon some basic analysis techniques that we employed, but also I want to give you a sense of how one single incident or event, or even atomic indicator within that incident, can be used to create a comprehensive protection package that can be used to protect many more organizations from the stewardship of WithSecure and beyond, and to really support the general body of knowledge for cyber threat intelligence. So before we start, I just want to explore one concept, and that is cybersecurity can feel impossible. Hopefully, I'll give you a sense of why that's okay. So we are inundated with pretty glib advice quite a lot of the time. Patch all the things and make sure you change all of your passwords and keep all the passwords that you use unique and rotate them every 90 days and make sure they are significantly complex or complex enough. And to be honest, I have hundreds of passwords. If I were to change these all 90 days, keep them all unique and at a serious, with a serious level of complexity, it's almost a full-time administrative job. And the same with patching all the things. Sometimes it's really easy to say and to throw that advice around, but in reality, when the rubber hits the road, it's not so easy to achieve. With the password example, the best tool that we have is a password manager, right? So you are attempting to do the right thing, to install your password manager, so you can be responsible with your identities. So you load up your web browser, you type in KeePass, you download it, and you import your password file, or you start to save your passwords, right? That is you doing the right thing. All the while, though, your passwords are stolen, cobalt strikes being deployed, attackers have moved across the network, servers are encrypted, and a ransom note has been deployed. So that's why kind of cybersecurity can feel impossible, and that is what happened to an organization and an individual here, and that is the basis of this webinar. So why does it feel like it's impossible? Well, they target us on a human level, right? There is no infallible technological tool or technology that can mitigate against attacks that are inherently human, right? Social engineering and undermining process. Legitimate trusted services are utilized really often now by threat actors in the wild. And the reason that's so successful is because there's an inherent level of trust. Even if it's tacit, there's an inherent level of trust into these services. And not only are attackers undermining our trust, but they're determined to undermine anything they can to access your networks and access your digital assets with a lot of resources and with capability that is only going to increase. And the way that really kind of shocks me is how attackers are able to make their attacks now almost indistinguishable from legitimate activity, and how they can undermine process in such a way that you may not even know you're being compromised. And that particularly comes as complexity increasingly gets obfuscated and hidden by IT services. So the objectives of this workshop are to say, do not worry, we are not ones to spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt. We would like to give you a sense of actually how, while it may feel impossible at times, it is inherently possible with the right skills and correct operationalization of threat intelligence. So easy for you to say. We're going to show some analysis techniques. Now, if you are a threat intelligence analyst or an incident response analyst, these may seem slightly basic to you. If you are not, hopefully then they shed a little bit of insight as to how operational threat intelligence analysts and investigators do operate, but mainly how we can proactively protect other people, whether that's our internal partners, customers, or even kind of society as a whole, from a single incident. What this workshop isn't is just a technical post-mortem of a single incident response case. So as I've alluded to already, the background here is KeePass, right? It's a really popular and common password manager. I personally use it. It's got an open source code base. That doesn't mean it's inherently insecure. That is a common misconception we have. But it was the root of a ransomware incident that we nicknamed Cadet Grey. Now, because KeePass is open source, that means the code base is available publicly, right? And what had happened was an attacker had downloaded the code base. They had made some really minor surgical modifications to it, and then recompiled it signed it, so for all intents and purposes, it was trusted and looked legitimate upon inspection of the binary itself. And when it was opened and when a KeyPass database file was imported, it would drop all of the passwords unencrypted in clear text locally for later exporting by the Cobalt Strike beacon. It would also load that Cobalt Strike beacon. The binary itself was undetected by endpoint protection services. Of course, there were behavioral things that we could detect. Really, I want to talk about the power of a single investigative thread here and how one indicator can actually be pulled apart and unpicked to form a comprehensive protection package. This is a redacted extract from our post-intrusion incident response report. Now, of course, in reality, we didn't start to investigate after the incident response report was written. So please do allow me this bit of artistic license in order just to articulate and enable me to visualize some of the data that we had. And really what we can see on the screen here is the advert information. So we now know that the user was duped by a malicious advert. We can see the URL that the user was redirected to. And this URL is something we're going to focus on, right? You may not be able to see it because the text is quite small. Apologies for that, but that is keypass-info.anus.com. So let's look at anus.com. And what we can see from anus here is a number of subdomains that look pretty suspicious, right? Let's drill into those a little bit more. So from anus.com, we have subdomains that that adhere to a couple of different themes. We can see our keypass-info subdomain. We can see woodforest-login. Now that is a US bank. We can see pump fun official, which is cryptocurrency related. We can also see WinSCP download. So actually what we've got here is quite an eclectic set of themes of the subdomains that hang off this anus.com higher level domain. Interestingly, the outcomes were different. We had two different Cobalt Strike beacons deployed from two different subdomains. You can see that from WinSCP and KeyPass. We can also see what we suspect to be phishing domains as well for the banking and cryptocurrency themed domains. What I want to do now is focus slightly more on the Cobalt Strike beacons and those two chimneys of activity that you can see on the left of that diagram. This was really interesting to us as we investigated, because actually what you can see is two different themes, but also driving two different but similar outcomes. So on the left-hand side, WinSCP download. WinSCP is, of course, a common Windows utility. And actually this behavior has been really heavily reported on in open source. We can see just a sample of different news articles and intelligence reports that have been reported on from WinSCP, Trojanized, dropping a malware loader called Nitrogen Loader with a Cobalt Strike beacon with a specific watermark. Now we know that this was connected and linked to a number of different ransomware families and incidents. On the keypass-info stovepipe, all we could really see in open source was the Cobalt Strike beacon being used. Now I want to drill into this a little bit more. What you can see underneath the fingerprint of the Cobalt Strike beacons is a set of numbers. Now that is the thumbprint of the Cobalt Strike instance. Now, because Cobalt Strike can be misused, in an effort to prevent this from happening, the developers of Cobalt Strike put on a pseudo watermark on the Cobalt Strike beacon so it could link a user to the instance. Now, of course, Cobalt Strike has been cracked and it is now being quite commonly misused. So this is not a smoking gun in terms of attribution to actors, but it does give us a little bit of a sense or a temperature check as to which actors are using which cracked versions of Cobalt Strike. So actually what we think is going on here is there are different Cobalt Strike instances being deployed, and therefore probably different actors deploying them, leading to different ransomware cases, but they are all using the same and tapping into the same ransomware and criminal ecosystem online. Now, what you can see by my slightly kind of yellowed boxes in the activity is what has been covered in open source before. We can see that the key pass and key loader has not been documented anywhere, but the beacon has, and it's been historically linked to actors associated with Blackbuster ransomware. Blackbuster was a ransomware family that we think is now defunct. At the moment of recording, of course, the actors are still active, but ransomware brands are pretty variable. So now we want to look at the propagation of this campaign. We know that they are propagated through malicious ads, and in Europe there is legislation that enforces a level of transparency on the adverts that are run. This is great for us. It means that we can look into the adverts and we can see who is advertising malicious elements, or even kind of how successful the ads have been. And here we can see a Japanese organization is propagating the ads. Now, this is not to say that the Japanese organization is the threat actor here. It is entirely likely that they are compromised themselves. But within their kind of ad profile, we can see a number of the domains that we noted earlier. We can see DEX Screener, we can see our KeyPass info advert, for example. So there is a campaign of ads being run, all pointing to this ANIS domain. We can look into the ad in a little bit more detail, or a specific ad, and we can see that the KeyPass ad ran for 24 hours and generated 5,000 to 10,000 impressions. That doesn't mean 5,000 to 10,000 victims, but impressions across the entirety of Europe, pretty much. I mean, of course, France and Germany were the heaviest hit, but there was at least some impressions in pretty much every European country. Right, so this is pretty effective. If there's 5,000 to 10,000 impressions on a single ad for a single domain on a single day, what happens when you start to consider this a wide and broad campaign? For example, we saw how many outcomes there were from just one domain. Now, what if that same threat actor was advertising across 10 domains, each with 10 subdomains across 10 days, for example? Those numbers compound really, really fast. So let's get stuck into this domain and start to pivot around. Now, the very first, very basic pivot we can do is the domain content. So just at a really high level, the threat actors or a threat actor would malvertise this domain. That would then redirect to a typo squat domain, and then a domain where the payload was served from. We're focusing here on the malvertising domain. And we can do a domain pivot. So this is just an example of what attributes the domain has and some of the content on that domain. We use a tool called URL Scan Pro to do that. It's really, really powerful. And we managed to pivot into a new domain using this. So we can see the KeyPass-download subdomain pointed at by the yellow arrow. So the KeyPass theme was a bit of a clue, but also what we can see is common attributes across the domain. So the first common attribute is the validity period within a time range. 3 months is not typically a long enough validity period for a legitimate domain. There are, of course, some business uses for that, for temporary events, etc. We can see they're hosted on cloudflare.net. Again, none of these attributes in isolation are smoking guns or clues, but when you start pulling them together, and particularly with the final attribute, which is the domain content, you can start to come up with a picture of the broader campaign that's being undertaken. Now, we have access in WithSecure to a really, really powerful tool that can actually enable you to search across the content of every indexed website on the internet. Now, that tool is called google.com, a really basic but powerful tool. You shouldn't underestimate its power, particularly in investigations. But what we can see here again is a lot more domains that have been built with the same template. Again, not necessarily malicious or inherently malicious in themselves, but when you start to kind of pull together all of the other attributes, so the softer attributes, let's say, you can start to close in on some more legitimate activity. And we find two more: insights for consultancy and GRM space, both with KeyPass themes. These same pivots and principles can be applied on the typo squat domain. And here we can see a number of more domains spoofing KeyPass, for example. Now, in this sense, it is inherently possible that not all of those domains are specifically linked to our specific campaign. There may be other threat actors targeting KeyPass. In fact, it's highly likely. So you may want to perform some further analysis into those. We did. But also you may be happy to not trust them and move on. And anyway, these domains will then redirect to a payload domain where the malware is served from. And let's investigate the malware now. So I'm just going to kind of talk through the key path structure. Is really basically made of 3 components, or at least 3 components that we care about in the context of this investigation. One is the installer file, one is the main executable, and one is the helper file. And these are the kind of 3 files that we particularly care about. The installer file, because it's an archive of the main executable and the helper file. And there are, of course, other files and components within that we don't really care about so much in the context of this. For example, image files, picture files, style files, for example. But these are the 3 files that actors are interested in. And our third pivot now, PDB paths. So this contains the location of a file that contains debug information for a compiled program. That's essentially a kind of a wordy way of saying that it suggests different versions of software were created in the same development environment. In an even smaller nutshell, it links different versions of software to the same developer, right? So it's a really good pivot point to understand where there has been a kind of malware development campaign, for example, or even legitimate software, of course. That's its intent. So let's pivot. So both of our key paths and our inst util helper file had PDP paths. Let's start with the key path installer, and using VirusTotal we can search for it, and we found another key path installer that was part of a new sample, as is highlighted there. So we now have pivoted from sample 1 to sample 2. Exactly the same principle applies for the helper file. A different new PDB path finds us part of a 3rd sample. So we're now on 3. Another pivot we can use, a pivot on the certificate. Now, I mentioned earlier that these implants were signed. What we do know now from leaked ransomware chat logs is certificates are expensive to threat actors. They can spend thousands and thousands of US dollars on a code signing certificate that has been stolen or created, and they will. Remember, the threat actors and the adversaries we're up against here are very well resourced. However, because they are so expensive, from time to time, actors will reuse them across different samples. And we have the ability within WithSecure, and there are plenty of open source tools that can do this, to actually take the certificate information and search for it. So we have multiple tens of terabytes of malware that we have collected over the years of WithSecure. And we are able to interrogate attributes across our entire malware corpus, coming in from sample exchanges that we participate in, but also from our EPP products as well, and our anti-malware and EPP engines. And what we can do really simply is search for the thumbprint or files that have been signed by a certain certificate, the thumbprint of that certificate in this sense. We can, of course, use different pivots as well using our proprietary portal here that is built on Splunk. But what you can see is 6 samples have been found within our database. Now, if you remember that each kind of sample was made up of 3 components, therefore within the 6 there is a 4th sample. So now we have 4 samples, pivot 5, detection pivot. In fact, 4 is quite a good number to build detections on, because what you can do is you can kind of make sure that you can detect 1 or 2 and use the 3rd or 4th as false positive catches as well. We, of course, have a number of legitimate samples as well. So we can make sure that the lasso that we are throwing around all of the samples that we are seeing is as precise as possible, i.e. we are collecting all of the bad without collecting any of the good. You can see on the screen some detection logic that we utilized for this, but also a screenshot of our Splunk database, which maybe isn't the most visually appealing, but it gives us an idea of where we have other malicious samples that have matched our detection across our EPP estate, potentially sitting in the download folder of our users, for example. And we find some more samples. We actually find 2 more samples. Now, these can be rearranged looking at the metadata of these samples, and we actually built out a timeline of implant development. And we can see that the threat actors were iteratively improving the key paths across this time period. So we now know that the campaign lasted for at least 4 months. The earlier Samples were a little bit more rudimental than the later ones. There was certificate reuse earlier on in the campaign, again, likely a way for threat actors to save money. But of course, the more you reuse your certificates, the more chance that they are blown or noticed by threat actors. Also, we saw that the early iterations of this key pass Trojan would directly exfiltrate the password file to an attacker-controlled server. Now, of course, that is a little bit more simple for the attacker, but it is, of course, more noisy, and it's erroneous behavior and gives the defenders more of a chance to catch and identify that as malicious. So actually what we can see is a marked and definitive attempt by the malware authors here to make sure that their malware is as stealthy as possible. But we've got a really good understanding of the campaign now, largely, in fact, these pivots that all came from one single indicator. We know its time span, we understand how it's propagated, the tools and techniques used by the actors. We've managed to link it to other campaigns, if you remember the WinSCP activity and some of the other kind of phishing. And I guess maybe not from the indicator, but from our incident response case, we now know what can happen if the activity is left unchecked. This is really important because it enables us to contextualize risk. Now, this is really, really important if you consider the detection pivot that we undertook. That means that there is inherently more than one victim across our telemetry, which means we need to now proactively engage these organizations and let them know what is going on, but also give them the ability to make a risk-informed decision, i.e. this is the impact if this activity is left unchecked. This is what we believe can happen. So protecting our customers. I mean, the first thing is threat hunting using the atomic indicators. We have pulled together a large list of indicators of compromise, whether that be malware hash values, whether that be URLs, domain names, detections, command lines, even some behavioral patterns, right? And these are our atomic indicators. Now, in WithSecure, we constantly have an engine running to absorb all of these and to sweep across our customer estates for them to give us an early heads up for other organizations being impacted. And this slide is just a kind of a high level example of how we can take, for example, a command line, find some more victims, find some more kind of malicious artifacts from there, and pivot round into a list of organizations that are potentially impacted by this activity that haven't yet felt the impact of the impact of the actions on objectives, whether that be ransomware or data theft or anything else. And that's really key for us, right? Because it's turning reactivity into proactivity. Of course, this came from an incident response engagement, and one victim, unfortunately, fell victim to that rather unfairly, I think, because as we mentioned earlier, they were trying to do the right things. However, from this, we now know that certificates have been reported and revoked, samples detected and blocked. The behavior is detected and blocked as well. We've got hunting queries as well if it kind of develops outside of those behavioral patterns. Victims have been notified and advised. Remember, if our EPP product can remove the malicious binaries, there is an inherent risk that organizations' passwords have been stolen. Of course, that was one of the core components and functionalities of KeyPass or Keyloader, and there's no real tool or technique that can automatically change everybody's passwords in such a way that it wouldn't be highly disruptive. So we can engage the organizations and say, not only is this the risk if left unchecked, but this is what you need to do, and only you can do as administrators. And the community was forewarned through reporting. Now, the very first thing we did once we find these malicious samples that we believe to be undetected by antivirus engines is create a hash-based detection for it. Of course, hash-based detections aren't the best because it's really trivial for an attacker to change. So as we went through, we built more and more detections for this. However, 1 week after the report was released publicly into this, what you can actually see was at least 31 other of our kind of industrial peers had released detections as well, which means all of their customers are protected. And I say at least 31 because VirusTotal does not always represent the core set of capabilities for detecting malware. So we moved from one victim to thousands now protected, which is a really positive outcome. So the conclusions here: cybersecurity is a human problem. Remember, if an attacker is seeking to undermine trust, whether that's inherent or in a process, i.e., there is no reason that an average user should expect Google to serve them malicious responses to a search query. There is no reason to suspect that antivirus misses occur if you are a typical user. It's important to note that there is a human element to this, right? And tools are not infallible to that. No organization is completely insulated from such attacks. This is a really important piece, right? Many organizations that I talk to are still flying under this false sense of security based on the fact that they do not believe that they would be interesting to cyber attackers, right? They are not in an interesting enough industry or geography or vertical or whatever to be of interest. That is not true. If you have a web presence, you are a target. In this case, no organization was specifically targeted. This was watering hole style. They just posted up a malicious downloader and advertised it and waited for the victims to come to them. And that can happen to anybody. And with ransomware and data theft and extortion in that sense, any equity on a network can be monetized by threat actors. It's a really important note. But the good news is, with the right set of skills, a comprehensive protection package can be built. Sometimes that even comes from just one indicator of compromise, and we can impose costs on the adversaries. Now, as a result of this investigation, the certificates were revoked, right? They are expensive for threat actors. That's just one example of how we impose some cost on them and we can keep disrupting them. Thanks very much.